and welcome to this edition of Access Rhode Island. I'm the Reverend Dr. Don Anderson, Executive Minister of the Rhode Island State Council of Churches, and we want to welcome you to this edition as we host a conversation about providing healthy choices for people in their eating habits, especially fresh produce in the urban core. I have two guests with us this evening to help us talk about this particular topic. The first is the Reverend Dr. Anita. She is currently the pastor of the Emmanuel Church in Newport. She's been someone who's been in ministry for over 30 years, and interestingly enough, she began her ministry at the Trinity Church on Wall Street. That would be a whole separate conversation to talk about what Trinity Church in Wall Street would be like. She did write her doctoral thesis, however, on the topic, How Then Shall We Live? An Interreligious Eco-Justice Model for Local Community. She is, and she won an award for that. She also is the president of the Rhode Island Interfaith Power and Light program. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as the program goes on as well. Anita, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Don.
Our second guest is Leo Pollock. Leo, until recently, worked at the Southside Community Land Trust, and he's left that position within the last year to start his own business with someone else. And we'll give you a chance to plug that in just a second, Leo. But he currently serves as the network coordinator for the Rhode Island Food Policy Council, and we're so glad to have him here. Welcome, Leo.
Thank you, Don.
Good. Before we get started, tell us a little bit about your company. I want to make sure we get a plug in because I find it fascinating.
So my partner and I formed the compost plant last October, and we're looking to be Rhode Island's first full-service commercial composting. So we collect food waste from restaurants and institutions. We're working on a site to process it, and we'll be selling compost to increase food production in Rhode Island starting next year.
And how's that going?
It's great. We're really seeing not enough infrastructure in the state for composting, but Rhode Island just passed a bill mandating that large-scale generators of food waste will need to start diverting from landfill. And we also have a landfill that has only about 20 to 25 years. So we need to really start rethinking waste in Rhode Island.
Yes, I don't know if anyone's been by the landfill recently, but it's I call it Mount Rhode Island, and it's in need of scaling down what we put there. So
absolutely,
that's great. That has a lot of benefits for many people. So.
Absolutely.
That's terrific. Well, as we talk about this problem of getting fresh produce to people in the urban core, I know that the Rhode Island Food Bank has done a study on food insecurity in Rhode Island. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, Leo, and kind of set the stage for what's happening in Rhode Island?
So every year the Rhode Island Community Food Bank does a hunger report. And if you look at some of the trends just over the last years in Rhode Island, we're really seeing some troubling signs. Rhode Island, as of 2013, had the highest rate of food insecurity in New England, just over 15%. So that really means that...
So let's stop for just a second. I want you to repeat that statistic so everybody hears that. Could you repeat that again?
Yeah, so Rhode Island in 2013 had the highest rate of food insecurity in the New England region. So 15.4% of Rhode Islanders are food insecure, and that means that they in some way don't know exactly where their next meal will come from. Either don't have the funds to afford food, or are really finding limited access to fresh, healthy food.
That's great. Now, Anita, you live in Newport, and we know Newport is a wealthy place, so there's no problem like this in Newport, right?
Oh, no problem at all. No problem at all. At my church, Emmanuel Episcopal Church in Newport, decades ago, started a meal program there. It's through the Maher Center and some other organizations at the time. The interesting thing is that blossomed so that there is a soup kitchen every night of the week, every night of the year, and they are packed. We host one of them once a month at Emmanuel with at least 80 to 100 people each time we host, and that's every night. There is a major food crisis in Newport. Newport is not all the beautiful, wealthy mansions on Bellevue Avenue, which are beautiful and lovely. Newport is one of the highest poverty rates in the state as well, and it's reflected in the food insecurity issues of which you just heard from Leo.
So tell me, you're president of Interfaith Power and Light, which has to do with eco-justice and all of those kinds of things. How does Interfaith Power and Light hook into this particular issue of food insecurity?
All the injustice issues that we see in our society, from the global to the national to right here in Rhode Island, all affect people who are impoverished, who are living at the economic fringes of society first and worst. And in Rhode Island Interfaith Power and Light, specifically we address issues of energy, of which food is reliant, because we need energy not only to grow food, but also to transport it. And so what we have seen here in Rhode Island is that serving people who don't have choices about the kind of ways they heat their home. They don't have choices about buying healthy, nutritious food. That having secure income gives you choice, not only the energy choices you make, but also related to that, the food. And so it's wonderful to see all these beautiful farmers markets popping up all over the state, and we're grateful for those. But often they are outpricing the very people who need nutritious, wholesome food the most. So this is something specifically that Rhode Island Interfaith Power and Light, working with other organizations such as yours, want to begin to address. Because the other way energy specifically looks at this is that it costs money to move our food across the country.
Sure.
Those costs are all somewhat hidden, but they're all costs of gasoline in the trucks that move the food across the country, let alone in the airplanes across the world. And so if we can, on our local level, encourage local buying, that is local food growing your own food, and we can bring the prices down by the sheer demand of that, but also give people a sense of pride in their community as opposed to buying food that's nowhere connected to the community and the costs incurred to the environment by shipping it across the state, across the country, across the world.
Leo, I heard some moral and ethical issues in what Anita just said, and from your work, what are some of the moral and ethical issues that you see that relate to this particular issue?
I mean, I think Anita raised a really powerful one, which is, Rhode Island is seeing kind of two, not divergent trends, but you're seeing, on the one hand, a real growth in the local food sector. So more and more people are seeing farmers markets. A lot of farmers, a lot of farm viability is based on being able to sell directly to consumers. Farmers get a higher price from not having a middleman involved.
Sure.
But what we're seeing is farmers markets are reaching a limited audience, and there's still real issues of access to healthy food, especially in urban areas where there aren't full-service supermarkets, there aren't necessarily as many farmers markets. And so on the one hand, we are seeing some real encouraging trends with more farmers increasing in the U.S. ag census. We're seeing more farmland come back into production, but we're also at the same time still seeing, as we mentioned before, some of these really troubling rates of more people that don't have access to fresh food, very high unemployment rate, high rates of poverty. And so the Food Policy Council and Interfaith Power and Light, the priority is really seeing how do we make sure that local food in particular is benefiting all Rhode Islanders, not just a few Rhode Islanders.
That's great. I know I'm going to date myself here, but having grown up in Rhode Island, I remember back in the 50s and 60s where many places where there are houses now, there were dairy farms. Down in South County where we have sod farms, people grew potatoes there. And there was a lot of local produce. In fact, I think I was sharing with you, we used to go down the Phoenix Avenue in Western Cranston to the DePippo family food stand. And we bought food, and it was, I remember my mother talking about the fact that it was cheaper than it was to buy it at the supermarket. Unfortunately, we've seen that flip. And one of the moral issues that we certainly care about in the faith community is seeing that those people who are at that lower socioeconomic ladder have the opportunity to access food. I think about the passages in the Hebrew scriptures that talk about, when you're harvesting, make sure you leave enough behind for people to be able to come by and glean and to be able to pick food up, and don't clean, 100% there. So there are a lot of biblical and moral issues that relate to this, and that's why we want to be engaged in doing this and working on this together. So there are some things that are happening. That's the good news, right? There are some things that are happening. And Leo, could you talk a little bit about it? I know there's a project that Interfaith Power and Light's part of. We've been on the fringes of the project, but has to do with Brown and a class. Could you talk a little bit about what's happening with that?
Yeah, so this is a project that is just getting started. So there's a Brown Environmental Studies class. Professor Don King, who is one of the members of the Rhode Island Food Policy Council, in thinking about ways to connect with Interfaith Power and Light, the students are actually willing to, starting to do some survey and outreach work to faith communities across Rhode Island, and really to say, are congregations interested in food as a social justice opportunity, and do different congregations have potentially land available that may be suitable for food production at different levels, whether it's a community garden that really invites people in to be able to be part of growing their own food, or if there's larger tracts of land, is there the potential to grow food for donation to the food bank, or even potentially to lease to a farmer with the requirement that some of that food either be donated or specifically be targeted at people in low-income areas where there is an issue of access. So I think there's a real opportunity around engagement and also around taking available land and really rethinking how could this be used in a way that helps support local food production and decreases kind of the food insecurity that we're seeing in the state.
That's great. Anita, you're over on Aquidneck Island.
I am.
Which for some Rhode Islanders is a foreign country. But there is a great project that several congregations have gotten together to do over on Aquidneck Island. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
I sure could. We're talking about the Methodist Community Garden, which is on acres of land in Middletown. It's a collaborative effort between the three Methodist churches on Aquidneck Island, and it's run sort of out of Portsmouth by the leader, the person who began the program, Linda Coleman, but it now is part of the collaborative work of all three Methodist churches, and it exists on the property of the Middletown Community Gardens, Methodist Church there on Turner Road. It's a model of what we've been talking about already. The community is really involved, and not only are there wonderful efforts in terms of volunteerism from all different constituencies on the island, but also there is a particular garden there designed for people who are in wheelchairs so that they can come and garden there. And the distribution of the tons and tons of food each summer is remarkable. It's overseen by the woman who started it, but also it is managed by hundreds of volunteers who get not only the time to help grow, to plant and cultivate the land, but also then to help in the distribution, which goes out to many of which have spoken about already, the soup kitchens, but others in need. They even have a new thing this year, was a community garden card, kind of operates like a SNAP card or a food card. Oh. And they gave out to the churches so that if someone comes to Emmanuel looking for a food assistance, I can give them a card so that they can purchase free produce at the community garden.
That's very cool.
That is very cool, because food security also means security for good produce, not for cheap fast food.
A year ago, I toured that community garden. And one of the things that I thought was just amazing, first of all, was the size of the garden. This is a huge garden. And the other thing is 2 greenhouses. In fact, I was there in the fall, and we're still waiting for one more crop to come in November of root vegetables. The other story that I thought was just amazing about this, and just adds to the whole premise of community gardens and working together, is the director said that someone approached her who did a special needs camp for high school students in the summer. And they asked if they could bring 2 special needs young people to the garden to work for a week, and then each week have 2 different ones. Absolutely. And the person who was running the garden said that she thought idealistically this was a great idea, but she'd never worked with special needs folks, and she just really wasn't sure how it was going to work. And she said within a day, she'd fallen in love with these 2 students. They were incredibly productive. what they added in terms of the soul of the place was amazing. And she said one of the problems she started having at the end of the week was she was going to have to give them up. And obviously she could never love two students as much as she loved these students. Well, she had the exact same experience every week during the summer. These new students would come in and she would fall in love with these young people all over again. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to get people together from various segments of the community that wouldn't normally be together or work on something together.
It is, because it really is cutting across, speaking what we're speaking at the beginning, of all socioeconomic lines. And that's, we all have to eat, and we all have a right, I would say, to eat good and nutritious local food. And so how do we collectively work towards those goals? And I think it's a model of God's kingdom to see all people from all backgrounds and abilities coming together to grow their own food.
Anita, you were in Vermont before you came to Rhode Island. And while you were there, you were working on your doctorate. And I want to hear a little bit about your premise of your doctoral thesis. But you told us before the program a great story about someone who worked with you at the church.
Boy, did I tell a story. That's a wonderful segue, Don. So my parish administrator, when I hired her, was living in her minivan car with her 6 children, living in her car. And when she came to work at St. Peter's in Bennington, she began to get her life back together and eventually had a place outside her car to live with her children. And that community, like all communities, was very generous and brought food regularly to Rebecca and her children. And not just prepared food, but beautiful turkeys and vegetables, which she would graciously receive. And after this had gone on for about half a year, been through both Thanksgiving and Christmas with all the beautiful produce you get with the turkeys. At those times of year, she came and said to me, I don't know how to cook any of this. This is also different from when we grew up, that not all families learn to cook in the same way. Not all families have. She didn't have the means for a while to cook. She had no kitchen. Mm-hmm. So she was relying on handouts, but often handouts that either it was quick, fast food, or if it was food that needed to be prepared, she wasn't able to use it. And so Rebecca had got me thinking, and not only did we start a community garden at my church there, but we also started a community cooking classes. Everything from putting food by to freezing it to learning how, under lots of supervision, to cut and prepare food. And we collaborated with one of the local middle schools where children were at great risk. She wasn't the only family, obviously, nor is that would be the only family in Newport, not at all. And so we were then able to work with some of the teachers at the school to help identify the students most in need, who benefited, not unlike the students did this summer at the Middletown Garden, but also there in Bennington, benefited from the classes. And we called the program Blooming Chefs.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
Yes.
That's terrific. Leo, you're engaged, as we said already, with the Rhode Island Food Policy Council. And one of the objectives that you've mentioned to me about the Food Policy Council was to partner with faith-based communities to help increase access to land and healthy food for local communities. Can you talk a little bit about that for me and kind of expand on that and what that objective is all about?
Yeah, and I think this is so the Food Policy Council was started in 2011 and really a statewide advocacy organization, educational organization to really look at what are the opportunities to strengthen Rhode Island's food system. And we talked a little bit about not just from an economic standpoint, but from an environmental standpoint and a social justice standpoint. And that's where I think there really is a nice alignment with the faith community to be able to say food really is this universal connector for people, but we need to place values on it that really prioritize things like social justice, social equity. And so what we have seen is that there's an interest in the faith community of really tackling those issues that are a real alignment of values. That how do we start to both bring people together around food, have conversations about it, but also make sure that sort of no one is being left behind in that system. And that's where, land feels like one opportunity to talk about it, but it really is about how do we create better, stronger networks that really are teaching people things like as we increase the amount of local food grown in Rhode Island, there may be a lot of produce that people aren't familiar with or that people don't necessarily know how to cook. And so it really is a move towards what does it look like when we're eating, we're both connected with people or we're connected to where our food comes from. And then how do we really change our diets and the way we eat to reflect that as well? So we see that as obviously, there's a big education component to that. The Food Policy Council also works on things like policy change to remove any barriers that may be inhibiting what's happening in that system.
So what might be an example of a policy change that you'd work on?
So one of the things we're really going to be focusing on next year related to these exact issues are there's a program called SNAP incentive programs. And these are programs that when folks that are on SNAP, so this is food stamps or federal benefits,
yes.
There are a number of farmers markets in the state where people can use SNAP dollars to purchase food at farmers markets. Not all farmers markets in the state have that, and not all farmers markets also have an incentive program where essentially Farm Fresh Rhode Island runs incentive programs where for people who spend SNAP dollars, they get a 50% bonus of what they buy. So Farm Fresh Rhode Island is raising funds. People are accessing more fresh food, and those dollars are going directly to support producers in Rhode Island. And that's something we'd like to see expanded into more of a statewide program, and also to make sure that SNAP benefits are accepted at all farmers markets in the state. And so there's a little bit of a policy change that we could see having a major impact that economically benefits producers and really benefits sort of the most vulnerable populations that have limited access by increasing their purchasing power to buy fresh fruits and vegetables.
And is that a federal or a state policy that needs to be tweaked?
So it's federally funded,
State administered?
but it's administered through the state.
Okay. I worked for one of those programs when I first got out of college. They get very tricky. Anita, so let's say I'm a rabbi or an imam or a pastor, and we have a facility and we've got some land, but we don't have a big field. Can we still do something with cooking?
Yes,
I mean,
please. Yes,
How can we do
please.
that?
Well, my kind of dream is that every single religious congregation in this state, in the country, but let's stick to Rhode Island, should be associated with a community garden. You don't actually, as you know, don't need really that much land to garden. You don't need acres, not at all. Think your own yard. You need a plot, but it's amazing what can come from a plot. You can also grow things inside. But if every religious institution in this state could be associated with a community garden, you referenced how that could happen, either the land itself, either leasing some land that's currently not being used, and there's a fair amount of that. Even some places, ironically, I think in the past, who bought land thinking they would pave them over and make them parking lots. The Joni Mitchell song comes to mind about paving paradise and putting up a parking lot. Thankfully, that wasn't done too much. These institutions, these religious congregations, can also offer classes in food security. A lot of them have institutional-sized kitchens. Any faith-based organization that does any kind of soup kitchen has to be licensed by the state. So more likely than not, they've got a little bit of space, so they can provide cooking classes, as well as space to can or put, we as used to say, put food by. So you've got all kinds of things, including, goodness, every religious institution has some form of the coffee hour. And composting, coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are great in composting. And to start small, and once you put that can on the counter in the kitchen by the coffee maker, in the synagogue, in the temple, in the mosque, in the church, and then you have a space in your yard for composting. The visual has enormous effect. So those are 4 specific ways that every single congregation in this state can directly contribute to food security for all our residents.
That's great. Leo, you work in the more secular realm of things, and I heard part of your answer to my question about the food policy. But just to reemphasize, am I correct in saying that those organizations that are community-based organizations are open to working with faith-based organizations in this?
Absolutely. So, to give an example, when I was working at the Southside Community Land Trust, this is an organization that is really focused on urban gardening and urban farms in Providence specifically. And so I think most people have an idea of community gardens there as turning vacant lots, trash-filled lots into community gardens. That's one piece of it, but I mentioned an example when we were talking earlier, Don, about St. Michael's Church in South Providence.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that, because St. Michael's has so many cool things. But yeah, talk about St. Michael's.
But very diverse congregation, and this is true of a lot of the urban gardeners in Providence. A lot of newly arrived immigrants, a lot of refugee communities, people coming from really strong agricultural backgrounds, and that was true at St. Michael's. And so, working with the Southside Community Land Trust, they tore up the grass sort of in their back lot. And I would say that's probably 100 feet by 30 feet, so not an enormous space, and turned that into sort of a communal garden. And that's, I believe the produce there is shared among congregants who are part of the garden. But it really, to me, it's a statement about that's in the middle of an urban area. Mm-hmm. It is a church, and it's really saying that food production can be part of what a city looks like, and that because we have people coming from agricultural backgrounds who really want to have this connection to land and growing food, that's something that we can be a part of as well. And I think that's true across the state, whether you're in an urban area, a suburban area, or even a rural area. There are ways to really think about how faith communities can connect directly to food. And I think Anita said it very well. It's a community garden or some way of really being part of that gets people involved in it, starts to connect people, and starts to really change the conversation about why is food important, what does it mean to people, and how does that become part of these commitments to social justice and social equity.
So I'm pastoring a small church. I'm in West Pollock, and we have a little bit of land. And I grew up working on a dairy farm, shoveling manure. Okay, so that's my agricultural expertise. Once you get past shoveling the manure, not so much. My question is, so are there people in some of these community organizations that would be willing to come into my congregation and help train me and other people in my congregation in how to think through what makes sense for us and then get doing that?
Absolutely, and I think that's where the role of the Food Policy Council is really important. What we're working with this Brown Environmental Studies class now to do is really to try to get a sense of what are the different congregations that are interested, what land resources do they have available, and what's really a good fit for them. One of the lessons is agriculture is hard work. It's not something you can just instantly start and then leave. It really requires a commitment, and that there's a lot of gratification that comes out of that, but there are certain things that are needed to sustain it. And so the Food Policy Council really wants to help set people up for success. And working with Interfaith Power and Light, I think what we're trying to do as a starting point is what is available, and then what types of programs or what types of food production would be a good fit for that, and then to connect different congregations with resources to make that possible. Whether it's, if a group is interested in a community garden, we'd be happy to connect them with some of the folks at the Southside Community Land Trust or other community gardens that have learned about what really works for sustaining a community garden and how can they be successful in doing that.
That sounds great. Anita, as you think about Newport specifically, let's go down there. What kinds of things do you see that have potential for the next year or so? Where would you see things that could start to happen in the next year or so?
That's a great question. And in Newport, we do have a number of community gardens. As I said, the signature one right now is the large one in Middletown, but there's one that started at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Portsmouth. There's a lot of land, and it's been put in permanent conservation by the Aquidneck Land Trust. So land trusts are critical in this land and saving it specifically for farming purposes. So that's probably, and not just because they're Episcopal,